So, I guess the only question is, where to begin? Okay, there's just a lot to say here. Some of it very positive, while other bits are more negative than would have otherwise been anticipated on this channel. Especially since I said this the time that Jigsaw came out. Honestly, perfect for us fans, perfect for the franchise, and I knew that going in, and this movie really met my expectations and then exceeded them, at least in terms of what the story could have brought us. The point is, guys, just take what you will from this review and leave the rest to your own personal opinion. I know I am. Also, it's important to say that as time goes on, I'm generally gonna come around to this movie more than my initial viewing. Maybe by the third viewing, I'll mostly be able to see what all the generally good reviews were about.
Mostly.
So I guess the best place to start is at the beginning, and it's a good one. One of my initial concerns with the production of this movie was the need to bring Darren Lynn Bousman back to the director's chair after he left the franchise on a strong note with Saw 4. The reason for this wasn't due to his lack of talent as a filmmaker, but more so about his general mastery of all things Saw. For all the love that James Wan gets for the original movie, a lot of people tend to forget that their general perception of what a Saw movie was crafted by Darren Lynn Bousman. Under his helm, the franchise matured into the box office powerhouse that it was and reinvented the entire genre for nearly 6 years. So if anyone was going to make the quasi-spin-off soft reboot feel like the genuine article, while simultaneously getting the franchise hardcore fan base excited again, it was going to be Darren Lynn Bousman. And true to form, the beginning of this movie really sells that point home. For all the gloss and visual trickery of the trailers, this film feels like a Saw movie. And I don't really know how to explain that besides it being kind of dark and gritty, but highly sanitized. Like the camera kind of moves too smoothly to live in this particular world. Does that sound right? Let me know.
Your ideas are intriguing to me, and I wish to subscribe to your newsletter.
The opening trap is something to behold. Definitely not the best in the entire series, but certainly not the worst either. I think I would have liked it a little bit more if the focus wasn't directly on the overly fake prosthetic taking up nearly a third of the theater screen. Still, even though my particular fandom of this series doesn't come from the traps themselves, it was rather nice to see the series setting up a new take with the classic cult opening trap. But this is a Saw film after all. Opening traps are the staple, unbound, at least initially, to the overarching story and merely a table dressing for what's to come. The problems with this movie start in the very next scene as the audience is treated to Chris Rock's Zeke Banks going off on a piece of film trivia that felt dated over a decade ago.
Forrest Gump. Slow, yes, retarded, maybe, braces on his legs, but he charmed the pants off next to him and he won a ping pong competition? That ain't retarded.
And oh god, it isn't even the last time either.
You're my life now. I could kill you in a moment. I could destroy you. You don't know how long I've waited for you.
From there, we're treated to some of the most basic police procedural back and forth in modern cinema. Quite frankly, at times it felt like we were watching a comedy straight out of the 1980s.
The mayor called the chief called the deputy chief just chewed my ass out. You see I don't have any bit of it left, don't you?
Honestly, I don't think they pay cops enough.
Look at this badge, bitch! Check out the gun!
And you get what you pay for.
And in the middle of all this, one of the strangest wardrobe changes in recent memory.
What?
Okay, that one's a little bit more of a nitpick than anything else, but not really. At least for me, the first trailer made it seem like Chris Rock and Max Minghella had a bit more of a defined relationship.
You give a woman 600 Tuesdays. It ain't worth 3 Saturday nights.
And kind of on that note, this might totally be my fandom eating away at me because I certainly watched these two trailers more times than I probably should have. But just a quick study of what they showed us beforehand is kind of revealing to the end result. Like out of all the previous Saw movies, this one seems like it is either really edited down.
When was the last time you saw your father?
Or they were initially editing the footage to give a bit more of an approachable direction for new and old fans alike.
It's gonna go sideways fast.
In fact, there are some interviews with Darren Lynn Bousman who suggests that there's a lot more character work that was left on the editing room floor, and it really could have gone a long way to show the motivations and story that this movie was trying to convey. But who knows? From there, the movie starts slowly putting together all the necessary pieces to get us where it wants to go. And one of the most important ones is that of Chris Rock's Zeke seemingly being the only straight cop in the entire department. A department which, I might add, is completely separate from the one of the original movies, but we'll have to save that rant for later. Anyway, the movie plays out in a fairly basic manner as we jump from place to place, slowly putting together all the pieces for the ultimate conclusion. And sure enough, if you've ever seen a movie before, you can probably guess what the twist is fairly quickly. Seriously though, this movie does do a very strange thing by showcasing the traps halfway through in a vain attempt to keep you guessing, despite the fact that over half of its audience has probably figured out who it is at that point in time. And for its part, the movie does seem to know this, since its big reveal is done in a wide shot half a room away before any of the motivation for why all this was done is even put in front of our main character.
Oh my god! Trampoline! Trampoline!
He said what?
One big criticism I have that I'm not going to spend a ton of time on because I don't want it to be the sole focus of this video is that the film doesn't have enough Samuel L. Jackson. If you've seen both of the trailers, then you probably know how he's introduced. But again, because it's a trailer, the context is deliberately played with the order to sell the movie that they wanted you to think that you were getting and not the one that they actually made. By the time he shows up on the screen again, you'll nod your head with affirmation that this movie is suffering from expendable syndrome.
He loves playing in the jungle. It's his problem.
Regardless, Samuel L. Jackson is a trooper, and the back and forth between him and Chris Rock is truly some of the best in the entire series. It's kind of like the filmmakers lost a bit of control, or they took some of the riffing that was done on set and just kind of threw it in there because, well, it's heartwarming and the chemistry is just so on point, so the audience must have loved it in the test screenings. If anything, it kind of makes me wish that this movie was more of a father-son story than a half-hearted detective narrative. The problem with that initial scene between Chris Rock and Samuel L. Jackson is that chemistry isn't really carried over to the rest of the film or even greatly expanded upon. Sure, we do get some good scenes between the two and we get a sense that they really do care for one another, but it does feel kind of strange that we only get one lighthearted interaction between the two over the course of the entire movie. But moving on to other characters, the only other person in this film on top of Samuel L. Jackson that even is remotely worth talking about is Chris Rock himself, and he does fine. Outside of the horribly outdated jokes that we've already discussed, it does feel kind of strange to me that Chris Rock is in a Saw movie. Don't get me wrong, he does a pretty damn good job of it, especially between the back and forth of him and some of his co-stars. However, there are just so many points of this movie where his performance seems so misguided. Like, we know that he's supposed to come off as a gruff, hard-boiled cop who doesn't want the new fresh-faced detective tagging along by his side, but it's tired and disinteresting. And maybe that's the way that it's supposed to feel, but so often the dialogue comes across like it's a straight-faced joke instead of something being said in complete sincerity, or maybe something in between the two. It just feels really strange, and I'm not entirely sure what they were trying to do with it.
Hey, I can smell a cop a mile away.
Oh, I smell bad? What you trying to say?
Well, stop turning everything around. You're so damn touchy.
I would take a moment to talk about any other cast members from this movie, but in order to keep it as spoiler-free as possible for people who have not seen it because they haven't gotten their vaccine yet, or they're just not comfortable going to the movies, they're waiting for a home release or whatever, I'm going to be respectful. Those are the two people that you know who are going to be in this movie, and that's my thoughts on them. Moving on from the stereotypical story and acting, I feel like it's about time to start talking about the traps. And for what it's worth, I have to say, they're also fine. One is especially horrifying and entertaining to watch, if only if it wasn't immediately after one of the most laughably obnoxious clickbaiting, strictly for the trailer moments that I've ever seen in any modern day movie.
Oh, you have a bunch of metal toothpicks.
They're bobby pins.
What's a bobby pin?
Seriously, before this movie came out, I had a conversation about whether or not that scene was just a dream sequence and wasn't really happening in reality, and I could honestly say that I would have preferred that more. In fact, that wasn't even one of the only for the trailer shots that we got in the movie.
It could be anyone.
Seriously, what happened to this movie in the editing room?
It could be anyone.
If we're talking about the traps as a whole, then they come across as a little bit more personal in this movie than some of the earlier films in the franchise, and I guess in retrospect that's exactly what they wanted to do with this story. I do think it is kind of crazy that we've gotten 9 films into this franchise and we haven't had someone truly learn their lesson or do something that we weren't otherwise expecting at the end in order to throw off the narrative and leave us in a significant moment for the sequel. As it stands, I've never been a huge fan of the traps in these movies, and unfortunately, after everything else that this movie took from the previous 8, that seems to be the main focus. At its core, Spiral is a decent thriller, but it's a piss-poor Saw film. It might hit every single beat of a normal sequel, but at least for me, it strips away so much of everything that made the originals worth watching that it comes across more like a by-the-numbers ripoff of what made the original series so great instead of something that's deeply connected to the philosophy and lore of the original 8 movies. And that isn't to say that it isn't a Saw movie at heart. Just a brief glance of this movie and it's pretty clear that anyone would be hard-pressed to cut out all of the references and iconography of the original series sprinkled throughout the entire movie and come out with something even remotely coherent. But certain people, and by that I mean fans like myself, don't really watch these movies for the pig mask, the tape recorders, or anything like that. We watch it because this is a goddamn soap opera. Movies end only for sequels to pick up exactly where they left off. Characters are introduced and killed only to have more relevance later. Clues are set up only to be paid off multiple films down the line.
I just can't believe Stark would stoop to that. Right in the middle of Montana and Dakota's wedding.
It's convoluted and totally irresponsible for the mainstream success of a horror franchise. Still, I've yet to meet a single fan of the series that doesn't point to the series' continuity as its biggest strength. That's why it's always been strange to me that the loudest public discourse surrounding these movies was always about the traps themselves. Kind of like, this is what the fans really care about, when in reality, it's just the general public that expects that of the franchise. And somehow, most everyone behind the scenes just hasn't really learned that lesson yet. Instead of spending more and more money on follow-ups with less connective tissue in order to justify a ballooning production budget, just spend as little as possible to satisfy the core fans who will show up no matter what. And by no means am I saying that I want the series to devolve into direct-to-DVD nonsense, but even if it did, that doesn't mean that it would automatically suck. Just look at what the Chucky films were capable of doing during its direct-to-video run, and that was enough to justify it going to a direct-to-TV series follow-up. I mean, shit, give me something like that for Saw and I'd be sold. Regardless, there is nothing in this movie that even remotely attempts to connect to the main series as a whole. It just lives in that world. And honestly, I just have so many problems with that. But this review is so long already that we'll just have to hit them here just briefly and we can talk about them in another video.
Lisa and I built your room.
But I don't like this clown.
I wouldn't take it down if I were you. It's a load-bearing poster.
This is the second movie now where the public refuses to mention Amanda Young or Detective Mark Hoffman, not even in passing. I guess in fairness, this movie does make a bit of a reference to those characters, but not by name. More like a fourth wall break that doesn't make sense in the context of this world. In this movie, the police department is not the same one from the original series. It's another precinct. Who the hell would even care about that distinction? Why was it important to distinguish these characters in that way? And I feel like by doing this, they missed out on a lot of Easter eggs that they could have placed throughout the department. Kind of like how Saw 3D had a significant scene play out in the evidence department, an area where we visit in this movie, or how Jigsaw had Eleanor's warehouse to just give us a couple of Easter eggs of things that we had seen before. Article 8 appears to just be a thing. It has no connection to Eric Matthews or the cops and how they operated in the early 2000s or anything like that. Seriously, what would have been the harm by saying it happened 20 years ago instead of 12? Wait, does this movie take place before Jigsaw? Did I miss that? The killer is just a copycat with no meaningful connection to John Kramer. And no, I'm not saying that he needs to know John Kramer personally, or he had to be a secret apprentice or something else like that. The last movie introduced the Jigsaw Rules website that could have been utilized for this movie, and the killer's motivation, but that was never mentioned once. As it stands, the explanation is, well, Jigsaw was a famous killer, so people, will obviously copy him. No, screw that. Jigsaw doesn't just kill people with conventional weapons. You can't just say, well, of course people will emulate him because it isn't that easy. I remember before this movie came out, a lot of fans were trying to figure out what From the Book of Saul actually meant for the overall story. Lo and behold, the killer literally just takes a page out of Jigsaw's playbook and runs with it. That's the explanation. Hooray. Jigsaw has targeted cops since Saw 2. I know he doesn't solely focus on cops throughout the series, but directly calling it out as a distinction between the narrative focus feels a little like semantics, especially when the producers are already well aware that the series has an over-reliance on the procedural cop element. And finally, because this review is going to be much longer than I initially anticipated, the detective boardroom decoration is one of the worst pandering arrangements of set pieces in recent memory. I just have so many problems with this, but that's gonna have to wait for another video. At the end of the day, I'm left asking myself, who was this movie for? Recently, I read an interview with Spiral director Darren Lynn Bousman about his return to the franchise, in which he enthusiastically said he initially got on board after hearing Chris Rock's pitch about a hard-boiled detective story that was 7 meets 48 hours. And while I can honestly say that the end production reminds me of those two films, I'd argue that the final product feels like a pale comparison instead of an elevation of the pairing. For me, Spiral didn't need to be an homage to David Fincher's Seven because that's what I've always viewed the original as. Maybe not in scope or narrative, but certainly in tone and philosophy. As I said earlier, I don't fully understand why those behind the franchise keep going back to the same creative well, despite the fact that they've already admitted that at this point it is creatively bankrupt. We've already been here before. We've dealt with dirty cops, broken families, mean-spirited traps, and disappointing twists. Seeing them once again trying to rejuvenate one of my favorite franchises by spending a bunch of money on perceived star power instead of anything remotely new and original just kind of breaks me. I've argued before that the Saw franchise is better suited than pretty much any other horror franchise to do something new and original with each individual installment. Something like a courtroom setting would really elevate the narrative focus for a potential sequel and give a similar claustrophobic feel as the original, but it can go even further beyond that.
Even further beyond!
Watching this film for the first time, I briefly thought that we might be getting a Die Hard with a Vengeance storyline, where the copycat killer was putting cops through traps in order to distract from a bigger crime going on. And Chris Rock and Samuel L. Jackson would be the ones running around from place to place trying to save people from the traps that they were put in. I honestly think that would have been a more entertaining film than what we got. Hell, what about a Saw movie that takes place during a copycat killer's therapy session where the killer explains what he's doing and how he's done it, only for the end result to be an elaborate game?
I'm a serial killer. Oh, God.
I don't know, I'm not the person who writes this stuff. I just think that there's a lot more creative directions that they can go with this franchise. But even then, I think that's why I prefer Jigsaw over this film. I know a lot of people really don't like the 8th entry of this franchise, and I think that's fair. But for me, that film introduced us to something that could have really helped build the universe into something truly original going forward. Even if people weren't happy with the reliance on John Kramer and his top secret apprentice over the course of that film, I've already briefly mentioned Eleanor and the Jigsaw Rules website. And for me, the introduction of genuine fans of Jigsaw's legacy opened up an interesting direction for future sequels to explore. Not only do you have several apprentices potentially still alive, but you also have this dueling philosophy of those who only know what they believe they know about John, who never worked with him directly. And I guess you could make that argument with the things that we saw in this movie, but as I've already discussed, there's absolutely nothing in the movie to prove that, or that's even elaborated upon when it comes to the motivation of the killer. I mean, he literally says, Jigsaw had the right idea, don't you think? And then it's just basically left at that. I know of Jigsaw, so I'm doing a Jigsaw. Anyway, I can keep going over this for as long as I possibly can, but it has to end somewhere. I think a lot of people might walk away from this review thinking that I absolutely hated the movie, or that the film has turned me off of the franchise as a whole. But I'm not sure that's the case. No matter what, I am a fan, and I'm sure that I'm gonna get a better sense of what they were trying to do as I watch it a few more times. both in the theater and at home. Also, if anybody in charge is listening, please, please, please give us a few commentary tracks on the home release of this one. We haven't really gotten one in so long, and I think that this would go a long way in helping people in my shoes understanding what went on to create this film. So, guys and girls, I guess after so much deliberation, I have to give Spiral from the Book of Saul a not so solid $4.75 of the $9.50 that I paid to see it. As a fan, I would probably give it $27 because you know that I'm gonna buy it on video, but until then, I'm just gonna have to wait and see if it grows on me. There's a lot more to talk about when it comes to this movie, the future of the franchise, how it's doing in the box office, and a lot more of my nitpicks about the continuity of it all and everything, but like I said, that's going to have to wait for another video. I hope everyone is having a fantastic day. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit that bell over by the subscriber button to notify you every single time I upload. Also, if you'd be so kind, go down to the description section below, hit that link, and go check out Jacob's channel. He helped me come up with my thoughts and everything about this review, put them more into perspective, and get it out to you guys, so that would be fantastic. Hope everyone's having a good day. It's been real.